Hey guys, great hearing from you. Excellent question, Josh. This is going to be a long response, so this might take me a little bit of time to get through. So buckle up. So the question of death of the author actually has major ramifications if you extend it to every work that we interact with. Two main works in the context of our current government are the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I'll start with the Declaration of Independence first, then Constitution, then I'll go into how the theory of death of the author would tie to the ideas of conservatism versus progressivism. So an excellent series of works I would recommend you guys look into if you want to consider death of the author in the realm of our Declaration of Independence is the Lincoln and Douglas debates. So pretty much to give context, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were debating with each other because they were running for the same Senate seat in Illinois. And at one point in a couple of the debates, Senator Douglas made the argument that the Declaration of Independence was only a practical document, and as a result, the Declaration of Independence only meant that British people were seceding from British rule. That is all there is to it. There is no other main ideas or themes. However, Abraham Lincoln takes a very different approach. He says that if we look at the first couple paragraphs in the Declaration of Independence, we see that the founding fathers put in this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these inalienable rights that should apply to all humanity, and acknowledges that, look, that's not the case. Not everyone in humanity has access to these inalienable rights, but that was the ideal that in this Declaration of Independence, we determined our government would strive for, that we would go for life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And so in that claim, it sets the stage up for Lincoln eventually declaring war and saying no to the secession of the South. And it leads to a whole other host of things. Really, if you think about it, this is a death of the author question. It is, do we go with the ideals that were, like, are there ideals in our declaration that apply to how we run our constitutional government today? Or is that declaration, because it was only made in that time and because it was declaring independence from Great Britain, only in that context, and therefore these ideals do not necessarily apply? So that's how the death of the author really heavily is applicable to our Declaration of Independence. Now to our Constitution. I would argue our government is highly built on acknowledging what our author's intentions. If you look at just trying to define what the Constitution says government can and cannot do, and what states can and cannot do, and the rights of the people, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, they're all, in our political science studies, we consider them all contributing authors, even though Anti-Federalists were against the Constitution, because they shaped the end result, such as the Bill of Rights, hence why Anti-Federalists are applicable. But it also gave the Founding Fathers a lot of opportunities to expound upon what the Constitution meant. This is that contextual document that provides meaning. So here we have the author giving their own meaning to their own document that they made. And if you look at our Supreme Court, it's heavily like a lot of responses to court cases refer to Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. It's these ideas that we hold on to. And actually, our legal system is heavily dependent on this, following the author's intent. I mean, just think about constitutionality in the court of law. Determining whether something is constitutional or not. In order to determine if something is constitutional, you have to say, this is what the Constitution means. And so the question is, do we go based on the meaning of what the Founding Fathers said, which they backed up with their Federalist papers, and the Anti-Federalist papers deliberated, we got this final product, or do we say it shapes and changes over time? And that's really a false question, because really it does change over time. It's just how it changes is not necessarily, in my opinion, not necessarily how most people would expect it to. But the Founding Fathers did give a method for change, and that was the amendment process. So you have on one end conservatives who say the change is only by the amendment process, and progressives that say we need to take more extensive action. Now I'm going to take a step back from that. I'm not going to go any further in that part. I'm just going to go into conservatism perspective and progressive perspective in general, globally, to sort of show how death of the author still applies. For conservatism, I would refer you guys to Edmund Burke, the guy who wrote Reflections on Revolution in France. He's considered the main thinker for modern conservatism today. His perspective on government and change over time, when he reflected on the British government and reflected on the French Revolution, he said, the British government is built heavily on tradition. It's worked for several hundred years. You had through the Magna Carta, you had the king and the nobles making an agreement, and the people were happy with that agreement for centuries. There was a brief revolution in the late 1600s, but it was all for the purposes of heading back towards that ideal that was agreed upon. And he makes the argument that you have to go based on the ideas of the founders and their intent in order to have a proper understanding of what that original government is. And that if you go by rapid change without regard for that intent and without regard for that system, then you're going to go through blind change without procedure, without it being well thought out and actually going for improvement, but rather potentially dangerous overreaction, which he claimed that's what the French Revolution was, hence the Reign of Terror by Robespierre. The more progressive view is that change over time is quick change over time is natural, and that should be the process. A good example is Woodrow Wilson. He said in his book, What is Progress? The New Freedom, in one of his chapters, he directly said the Declaration of Independence does not apply to the modern context of the American people because everything is based on economics and this income inequality. And so the ideas of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, those are old. Those don't necessarily relate. It's this economic inequality issue. And he went on the argument that government should be able to be flexible and move with the moral will, the will of the people first and foremost, not necessarily backed on principle, which in that case means that we shouldn't go by the author's intent, that we should go by what the people in the current context who make the meaning and make the interpretation solely. And that should be the deciding factor. And that's how he envisioned the administrative state. He envisioned an aspect of government that was immune from politics and would carry out this moral will without being able to be influenced by government, without being able to be influenced by our president and our legislative and judicial branches, that they will carry out the will free from electoral interference and free from playing party politics. All of this to come to the conclusion that I would argue that conservatism is the argument that we should follow the intent of the author, and progressivism is more that we should go by the modern interpretation over time. Now, I will say there's a third option that we briefly discussed in my government classes, and that's the more recent option we've seen from the progressive movement, and that is the new postmodern perspective. And the postmodern perspective is really taking the whole death of the author further along than the progressive view, because the progressive view is that there is this moral will, and that moral will is the guiding force that directs. But with postmodernism, you have individual truths, and because of that, it's sort of splintered. There's no direct action. So how does an administrative state work with these different interest groups that aren't going towards this moral will per se, when they're all fractured and competing and contrasting with each other, and which a lot of people argue is one of the reasons why the administrative state is more dysfunctional, because we don't have these common ideals anymore. We can't agree on ideas and truths and objectives. We now are a very diverse country ideologically and intellectually, and because we're more diverse in that respect, we cannot reconcile our two ends, or multiple ends rather, and come to these differences. But yeah, if you want a lot of good reading on the stuff that I just brought up, there's a ton of links in the description below in this video. But yeah, when it comes down to it, it's asking about the ideological quandary of our time. How do we process truth once the writer has moved on? I greatly enjoyed this question, and I look forward to hearing your response, Robert. You guys have a great weekend.